struck by many things, and it did occur to me that particularly the second reading and the Gospel are almost a perfect description of what life in a religious community should look like. It doesn't always look that way, but that's certainly the ideal that all religious strive for. But there was one line in particular in the readings, and in particular in the second reading, which really caught my attention. It's the line which encourages us all to sing psalms and hymns and inspired songs to God. As I was reflecting on that, I found myself thinking about some of those words which recur over and over again in the Psalms, and which many of us use each day in our prayer. For some reason, I particularly found myself thinking about Psalm 116. I'm sure you all know it without me even mentioning what it is, but just in case, let me remind you. It's a psalm which I think can speak very directly today to all of us, but Thuy-Linh, in a special way to you on this very important day in your life. In that psalm, the writer asks a question. How can I repay the Lord for his goodness to me? Thuy-Linh, as you stand on the verge of making this extraordinary commitment today, I hope that that prayer rings true in your own heart. The gift of a religious vocation is a precious one, not given to all, and certainly not better than any other. But for those who are called, like you, it's the pathway to deep joy, to peace, to contentment. As you look back over the long journey, no doubt difficult at times, which has brought you to this church this afternoon, and as you remember with gratitude all those people through whom God has touched your life and led you forward, perhaps you're feeling a little like those two disciples on the road to Emmaus, who, as Jesus joined them on their journey, found that their hearts were burning within them. And perhaps too, as all of us share this moment with you, our hearts are burning as well. The example of faith and courage and fidelity which you are offering us today is inspiring, and it encourages each one of us to continue on our journey. And so with you we also can say today, how can I repay the Lord for his goodness to me? The answer that the psalm gives to that question is also very powerful, and I hope that it too makes sense to you this afternoon and to all of us. When the psalmist asks that question, how can I repay the Lord for his goodness to me? This is the answer that comes immediately. The cup of salvation I will raise and call on the Lord's name. For us as Christians, of course, these words point us to the Eucharist. The Eucharist that we're celebrating together here this afternoon. The Eucharist that we celebrate so often when we gather together as a community of faith. And also, of course, the Eucharist, which is the daily living out of our lives of faith and fidelity. For members of the Salesian family, the Eucharist has a central and indispensable place in our lives. Certainly for Don Bosco and for Mary Mazzarello, it was at the very heart of their lives and of their mission. That's true, of course, for every Christian and every religious family within the Church. But for us Salesians, perhaps it's the idea of presence, so intimately connected with the Eucharist, which speaks to us in a particularly powerful way. Our Salesian tradition encourages us to celebrate the Eucharist with great fidelity, with great reverence and with great love. In the Eucharist, we are drawn into an extraordinary and intimate communion with the Lord. And in and through that communion with the Lord, we're drawn into a communion with all our brothers and sisters. And that's how we become signs and bearers of God's love for others, especially the young. The more the Lord becomes present to us and in us, and the more we become present to him and in him, the more we are able to see with his eyes, to listen with his ears, to love with his heart. And in the end, it's his love rather than ours that really counts. And our love insofar as it shares in his and reflects his love to others. This is the vocation of every Christian, of every person gathered here in the church this afternoon, and for that very reason, all the more is it the vocation of a religious sister or brother or priest. The Lord becomes present to us so that through us he can be present in the lives of those to whom we're sent. But of course, if we're to carry him to others, we first must carry him in our own hearts and in our own lives. Perhaps this is why that same Salesian tradition also encourages us to remember the ongoing presence of Christ among us in the Blessed Sacrament. Losing ourselves in prayer in his presence, we can become living images of his presence among the young. When we go to meet them, it's Christ who meets them in us. There is another line in this very beautiful psalm which we can sing today as we celebrate Sister Thuy-Lin's final profession. It's the verse in which the one who prays it says, "My vows to the Lord I will fulfill before all his people." How precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones. This afternoon, in our presence, and much more importantly, of course, in God's presence, Thuy-Lin makes the vow forever to live in obedience, in chastity, and in poverty. This is, as the Salesian sisters and their tradition reminds us so powerfully, a radical living out of the Beatitudes of Jesus. In making this commitment and promising to make this the heart of her life forever, Thuy-Lin this afternoon and into the future becomes for us a prophetic figure. We might even say a kind of living sacrament. We're all called to live in poverty of spirit. We're all called to live in deep and lasting obedience to God's will in our lives. We're all called to live in relationships with others in a chaste and respectful way, knowing that we must never use others for our own purposes, but rather live with them in mutual love, respect and forgiveness. That's exactly what our second reading today reminds us of. And because it's the vocation of all of us, it's the special vocation of religious in the church to live this in such a clear and unambiguous way that the starkness, but also the beauty of the Christian way of life is always kept alive and vibrant and visible in the church. It is a kind of death, of course, a death to selfishness, to greed, to manipulation, to hard-heartedness. It's a death which is precious in the eyes of the Lord. In a few moments, as Thuy-Linh pronounces her vows and dies this death, she also rises to a new